Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing? Hopefully, people keep trickling in as we get the day started. But it's great to see all your wonderful faces here this morning, and let's kick off our second day at Surf here in the beautiful Da Nang. Welcome back to the main stage. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Geoffrey C., CEO of Choson Exchange, a devoted supporter of entrepreneurship in North Korea. Geoffrey C. has been cited frequently in the global media in North Korea's economic policies and business environment. Geoffrey founded Choson Exchange, a non-profit supporting frontier entrepreneurship in North Korea and Vietnam. His primary goal is to experiment with entrepreneurship education in one of the most challenging business environments in the world. Please welcome him on stage for his talk, From Pyongyang to Saigon, Observations on Frontier Entrepreneurship.
First off, I think, so background, you know what I do. I founded Choson Exchange, and our job is to support the entrepreneurship ecosystem in North Korea, which I think is one of the most challenging places in the world to do it. I think before I start, I kind of want to congratulate everyone. I think between attending this talk and going to the beach, I think you've made an excellent choice, a very difficult choice, but you've also put me in a very awkward position, because now I actually have to say something interesting to reward you for opting to come here instead of the beautiful beach in Da Nang. So thank you very much. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is this issue of frontier entrepreneurship and how this kind of ecosystems might be different from what we are used to. So I want to ask a very controversial question throughout my presentation. I admit that I don't have all the answers. And the focus of this question is that, I believe in the value of entrepreneurship. I think, like Jeff said, I believe we need an army of entrepreneurs. I think we solve problems, we contribute to the communities, we build livelihoods, and I think it's a very important thing. But very often we focus a lot on the kind of startup models, entrepreneurship models from Silicon Valley. And for a number of reasons, I'm a bit skeptical about whether these kinds of models work in a lot of frontier economies, which doesn't have a lot of the elements that allows Silicon Valley to be very successful. And my talk is kind of divided into two parts. I'm going to talk a bit about my background, my story, and kind of what inspired these questions, and then talk a bit about why I think that model may not work. And I want to leave you with this question of, what do we need to do differently to build an ecosystem in a place like Vietnam, North Korea, Cambodia, Laos, or other similar countries. So a bit about my background. I was born in Singapore, where there's a lot of policy work around entrepreneurship today. I went to the United States to do my undergraduate grad school. And after I left college, I worked at a consulting firm. My very last case was a strategy case on technology, big data for probably one of the biggest smartphone manufacturers in the world. I'm not going to name it. And it was a very interesting case. So it's a big data case. They're trying to figure out where it fits into their product strategy. And right after that, I joined with a friend in MIT to do a big data startup. And being very young, 6 months into the project, we got a check from, or we were offered a check from one of the Facebook co-founders, valuing our work at $7 million. And I was thinking to myself, like, wow, this guy's offering me this kind of money, and I do not even know what we're doing. We don't have a product. We don't know how we're going to make money from it. This doesn't make any sense at all. So we had a good chat with my co-founder. He decided that he wanted to pivot towards a consulting, and I decided to go kind of on a very offbeat track to work on this issue of entrepreneurship in North Korea. So what happened was that when I was still an undergraduate student, I had went to North Korea just kind of as a tourist. I was based in Beijing doing an internship at the World Economic Forum, and I had a lot of time. So I went to visit the country, and what I was very surprised when I was on the ground there was that I met a university student who was my tour guide. She was there to practice English, and she told me about how she wanted to be a business leader to show that females can be good business leaders. And this was very surprising to me, because I'd spent time in China, and generally when I help friends who write their university admissions essays, they would normally say, oh, I want to go to do this program because I want to help my country do this and this. So it was very refreshing for me to, one, hear that she was very interested in business and entrepreneurship, And number two, she had a very strong personal aspiration, something she wanted to prove. And I think those are the elements that make good entrepreneurs anywhere else in the world. So when I left the country, I was like, oh, I want to come back and try to do something to help someone like that. And before I left, I said, oh, what can I do for you? And she said, oh, could you bring an economics textbook and get it to me? And I was like, oh, that's very easy. I can go out, buy something in Beijing, and just send it to her. Turns out it doesn't really work that way in North Korea. And that ended up becoming a 2-year journey to figure out, like, okay, how do I get this thing to them? And by that time, I was kind of like, oh, I've spent all that work. I built the network. Let me try to do something else in the country. So that was how Choson Exchange came to be. About a year ago, I moved to Vietnam. And a big reason why I moved here was that we were bringing North Koreans to Vietnam to learn about how Vietnam is changing and what they can learn from this country. And I thought that this was such a natural base for both engaging the ecosystem, learning from what's happening here, and transferring those lessons to North Korea, which we hope would kind of emulate some of the successes that Vietnam has. So that's a bit of my background. So just a bit of our programs. Like Jeff, I believe we need an army of entrepreneurs. This is some people in that army. So we run a Women in Business program in North Korea. And the reason why we started on this program was actually kind of also very accidental. So in the 90s in North Korea, it was still a very patriarchal society. And when there was a famine in North Korea at that point in time. So what the government did was that they said, okay, there's this famine, but people need to feed themselves. The economic system was kind of breaking down. So all the males had to stay in their government positions. And the females were the ones who went out to the market and started doing trading and small-scale businesses. And a lot of those females are now running this first generation of, what I think of as startups in North Korea. So most of them are restaurants and so on and so forth, but they are actually the breadwinner in their families in North Korea. So this was something that really excited us, and it was a segment we decided to focus on, and that's kind of how we ended up kind of training a lot of female entrepreneurs in the country. Another group that we focus on are scientists, so people who are doing research in the lab, and kind of a lot of them started thinking about like, oh, how do I take some of the research ideas I've been doing and turn it into products? This is kind of one of the places where we do our projects, so we also invest a bit in innovation infrastructure, we build incubators, and I think this is another lesson that we learned from our efforts there. So when we're building these incubators, when we went in there, we were like, okay, we know what an incubator is, we know what an accelerator program is. So we went there, we said, okay, this is what you need to do to support your startups. You have this acceleration program, you run it for 3 months, and they learn all about this business, they test the idea, and they go out and start doing it. We brought them to Singapore, they interned in, I don't know if you know Block 71 in Singapore, so they interned in one of the investment arms of the government that was doing this acceleration program to kind of take back lessons. And the thing that was most interesting to me was that we were like, okay, this is what an incubator does, and this is what we want you to do. And they end up doing something entirely different, and I think they had the smarter idea than we had. So the problem they're trying to solve for was that in North Korea as a scientist, you cannot just say, I want to leave my job and go and do business. It was very difficult. The government assigned you that role, and you have to do it. So what they wanted the incubator for was that they would put it as an institute under as a research institute, and they were going to transfer scientists from their research role into the incubator. So technically, they're still scientists, but then they will be freed up to work on their business idea. And this kind of gave me a very important lesson about kind of frontier ecosystems. I think very often coming from outside, we believe that there are certain solutions that we are basically copying from kind of more developed markets. But kind of what you need to do is very often to focus on what is the local problem and what are you trying to solve for. And I think very often the people we work with are a lot smarter than we are in terms of figuring out what those problems are and how to tailor the solutions to solving those problems. So that was one thing that was just very fascinating to me. We also do a fair bit of angel investing in North Korea. And the focus of this angel investing is not so much about generating a financial return. Very often we look at this as a way to test out certain policies and regulations and kind of inform our partners on things that they need to change about those policies and regulations. So this is some of the products that the North Koreans who've been through our programs came up with. One is kind of a vacuum sealed window because it's very cold in North Korea. So they were the first people to produce this kind of windows. And that was a prototype of a drink that was supposed to be a stress reliever. It is not alcohol. It tastes more like mouthwash. And I think the point we want to make about these ideas is that, again, in a place like North Korea, a lot of the solutions that they need tend to be policy related. So they need protection for their property rights. They need a better system for allowing them to set up companies and actually own companies. And that was a big part of what our work was, working with them on the economic policy side of the issue. And that was actually the biggest help that the entrepreneurs wanted from us, to act as a channel to communicate their needs and concerns to the government as kind of a bit of a neutral third party. So that was a very interesting experience. And I kind of bring up all this point is because I think at the end of the day, the most critical thing we need to do in a frontier ecosystem is to figure out what the local problem is and how do we solve for it. And to do that, I think we need to do things very differently from a lot of the cut and paste models that we see, that people try to experiment. They say, oh, hey, we have very often, in Singapore and a lot of other ecosystems, you go there and people say, oh, we need a incubator, we need an accelerator program, we need venture capitalists, and once we have all these things, we would have a startup ecosystem. But very often I think we don't look at what the real situation is and kind of the underlying factors that allow you to build all those structures. So are we talking about the culture of risk-taking? Are we talking about the education of entrepreneurs? Are we talking about things like the norms of trust, network building, that then kind of from which all these kind of things pop up, or your incubators, your accelerators, and all that. So I think very often we don't really have that, and we try to kind of paste this kind of structures into a place where you don't really have the foundation for it. And I think that's something that we think is very important for frontier ecosystems. So talking about solving for local problem, one of the examples I want to use is this question of venture capital financing. So I personally believe that there are a lot of problems with how venture capital work, and I think those problems are especially so in a frontier ecosystem. So the way venture financing works is that if you want to be a very successful VC, you need to give back about 3 to 5x someone's money in about 7 to 10 years' time. So to get to that, the way it works is that if you say you invest $100 million in 10 companies, 4 of those companies in the valley will probably fail. 3 of them will give you about 1x return, so they maybe just return your capital. And then you have another 3 that are you have to have really, really strong success from them. These are your unicorns. You need to get $800 million to $1 billion. And those are the ones that actually allow you to get a 3x return. So I kind of run through just a quick example here. If you imagine you have 4 companies that failed, they don't give you any money back. You have 3 companies that just return you $30 million. And then you have another 3 companies that each get to $1 billion. And given your shares, say you have 10% of it, you basically end up with $300 million return there. And when you add it up, say on $100 million, you get 3x return, which is a pretty decent fund. Now the problem is that when you think about a frontier ecosystem, your failure rate normally is actually higher. You have a lot of other risks that you're dealing with, governance, and so on and so forth, that actually pushes up the failure rate. And then on the other hand, when you think about your successes, very often you're not talking about unicorns here. Your big success might be a $200 million exit. Because in order to get to a $1 billion exit, what do you need? You need a very, very strong ecosystem. You need good mentors, the best management team, top engineers, lots of experience, and you also need a lot of financing. So when I go back to what happened when I was in the US, we raised money, $700,000, $7 million pre-money valuation. People could do that even if you don't have a revenue, you don't have much of a product, and you can kind of keep raising money in the US until you hit an IPO, and you're still losing money, and people still keep funding you. In most parts of the world, that is not reality. So, if I was in Vietnam and I have a company and, I'm raising now another 100 million, very often the investor is going to look at it and say, hey, how are you generating profits? So you don't have that many companies that can continue raising money to grow. Second thing is that when you think about the size of the market, your biggest companies, very few of them can achieve that kind of valuation given the size of the markets outside of the US or China. So you don't really have that huge exits that gave you a 3 to 5x return. And I think that makes it very, very hard for venture financing to work in frontier ecosystems. It changes the kind of companies that people have to build. And I think those are very important lessons that we kind of forget. And kind of just to back up this point a little bit is that if you think about the returns on venture capital, so Cambridge Associates, which works advises a lot of the limited partners who invest in these VC funds, they actually have very good data from the US market. And actually up to probably the last 3 to 4 years, VC has never returned actually the cost of capital. So on average, the industry as a whole, if you put $10 million in 7 to 10 years' time, they're going to give you back less than $10 million. So that's something that's very troubling, and I think for a lot of the frontier ecosystems, that's probably going to be worse performance. So I think that's, again, going back to this question of like, what do we need to do differently, and how do we need to think differently about frontier ecosystems? The other point I want to make is about the role of government and policy. So when I was doing the work in North Korea, a lot of it we found kind of went back to this question of like, what does the government need to do? What kind of policies need to be in place? So I had this conversation once with this guy called Brett Feld. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. He's a very famous VC, and also I think probably very famous also just for the fact that he had turned Colorado Boulder into a startup ecosystem from nothing. It wasn't a startup hub. He went there and with a bunch of other guys who founded Techstars, made the place kind of a bit of a heaven for startups. And he wrote this book called Startup Communities. And in his book, he said that, the best role of government is to stay out of the picture. It has to be organic. The startup communities have to come up on their own. And that is the best way to do it. And we had a bit of a chat because he's writing a new book now. And he said that after writing that book and having traveled a little bit around the world, so he went to like Singapore, he went to a few other places like Korea, Israel, he said his key mistake when writing that book was to assume that the government didn't have a role. And in fact, he thinks that there are places now where the government has been very successful in pushing for a startup ecosystem, and they've kind of created something from nothing. And without that government intervention, things wouldn't have happened. So going back to this issue, I'm from Singapore. There's a lot of government involvement in the market. There's now a bit of a kind of a small, thriving startup ecosystem there. And the thing that surprises me most about this startup ecosystem is that the policies that they have done to promote it are very often different from kind of what we assume that we know about it. So one of the guys who was in the Prime Minister's office and helped us with this, helped us with one of our workshops, so he went with us to North Korea, and he went there to talk about, how did they build a startup ecosystem in Singapore. And what I found most interesting from his presentation was that he said that, the things that we see today in Singapore, like, government co-matching for investments, support to venture capitalists, space for startups, are a very recent thing. And when he traces the support for entrepreneurship in Singapore, it actually goes back 20, 25 years. And the examples he raised was that in the 90s, it was very hard to set up a company in Singapore because you had to register your company to a commercial address. And that was, for most people, quite expensive. People didn't want to take that jump to like rent an office space in the city area. And you couldn't register it to your home address. So what the government did was they said, okay, let's pass a regulation, and now people can set up a company and register it from their home address, and if it's not disruptive, they can run it from their home. And that itself was a very, very big change that lowered the cost of building a company in Singapore. So he pointed to that as one of the examples of things they did back in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, they focused a lot on education. They said students are not too creative, they're not risk-taking, they're not innovative, and we need to revamp the education system, starting from primary school to secondary school to high school, and then to the universities. And I thought like, oh wow, I didn't see that as something that was linked to entrepreneurship, but now that you draw the link, I was like, oh, I can see where the value is. And then only in the recent last 5 years, they have all these programs for like venture capital, for startups, incubation space. So for me, the key lesson is that when you kind of draw that span of history, I think there are many things that the government can do and should do that are not immediately things that you associate with startups, but are much more fundamental. It's about things about shaping the culture, shaping the way people think, their attitudes towards innovation, to risk-taking. And these are things that only the government can do. Very often as a private sector actor, you're not going to invest in this kind of things. And I think those are key policy areas that I think we very often ignore in startup ecosystems, which I think that there should be a lot more focus on. Yeah. So I think I gave a very, very brief overview of what I think is missing in the approach we have towards building startups, building entrepreneurship in a frontier economy. I think some of those lessons apply in Vietnam. I don't pretend to know we have all the answers right now. But I think the key thing I want people to kind of take away is more just the fact that, hey, we shouldn't be copying just what we see in a lot of developed markets or even in other kind of markets around the region. But rather we should be thinking of what are the kind of problems we are trying to solve for and develop solutions that are focused instead on those problems. And if I were to make a guess, I think the key things that are generally missing that people tend to overlook is this question of culture, of community building, trust building, norms, that I think is much more fundamental to a startup ecosystem. And that's kind of where you kind of get all the other things that you associate with startup ecosystem once that foundation is laid. So that's kind of the end of my formal presentation. Kind of really what I want this to be, to go where I want this to go is actually to have it be driven more by questions from the audience. Because as I mentioned, I have more questions than I have answers to those questions. So thank you very much.